On June 27, 1844, the prophet and founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith, was murdered in Carthage, Illinois. I'm Stephen Detloff, and this is the Strangers and Pilgrims podcast, telling of the story of the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. Our telling of the story of the death of Joseph Smith starts in December of 1843 with Porter Rockwell in jail in Independence, Missouri. And this is 6 months before Joseph's murder. The Missourians have Porter Rockwell in jail, but who they really want is Joseph Smith. But Porter is one of Joseph's best friends. They grew up just down the road from each other in upstate New York, and their families are friends. And Porter was one of the earliest converts to the church which Joseph founded, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Joseph trusts Porter. So these men in Missouri are hoping that they can get to Joseph Smith through Porter Rockwell. And they want to get Joseph in jail because if he's in jail, they can kill him. Or even better, if he's on his way to jail, they can kill him on the way there extrajudicially. And a lot of people want to kill Joseph Smith. From now until the time that Joseph is murdered, the goal of a hefty portion of people in this part of the country is to have him killed or to be the one that kills him. And for now, I'm just going to say that one of the reasons that people want to kill Joseph is because they believe that if you kill the prophet and the founder of this new church, then the church itself will kind of fall apart. The state of Missouri has Porter Rockwell in a dungeon cell. It's a basement room with a low ceiling with a hatch in it. You can let down a rope or a ladder to crawl in and out of it, and Porter's hands and feet are ironed to the floor with chains. And he's been in multiple jails for the last 10 months or so, and his hair and beard are matted flat with mud and dirt. And Porter was put in jail after being caught by a bounty hunter in St. Louis, over 200 miles east of Independence. Porter had a bounty out for his capture for the attempted assassination of the former governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs. Ex-Governor Boggs had been shot a year earlier in his home. He was sitting in his home one rainy night in a room by himself in Independence when someone shot a pistol loaded with buckshot through his window. And 2 of the pieces of buckshot got him in the head, and one actually broke through the skull and got down to his brain. But the ex-governor didn't die. Everyone thought he had, though. Newspapers were publishing obituaries, and Missourians were eulogizing him. When the gunshot went off, Boggs' wife and son ran in to find him laying on the floor in a pool of blood. And they ran outside and looked around for the shooter, but they couldn't find the shooter, only the gun. And almost immediately, after people heard about the ex-governor getting shot, they started pointing fingers at the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. People were writing editorials in the newspapers about how it was probably their prophet and leader Joseph Smith who had done it, or called for it to be done. And everyone knew that the Latter-day Saints and the Missourians didn't like one another. And Joseph Smith almost immediately, too, began arguing against these claims. He wrote into one newspaper defending himself, saying that he didn't do it. He said he was, quote, tired of the misrepresentation, calumny, and detraction heaped upon me by wicked men, end quote. And like we mentioned in the podcast's introduction, for the last 14 years of his life, Joseph was constantly persecuted by his enemies. And so Joseph sees himself being falsely accused of an attempted murder in newspapers all over the American West, and to him, this is not an isolated incident. It's another instance of this decade of persecution, or this decade and a half of persecution. It's a part of this continuous stream of, quote, misrepresentation, calumny, and detraction, end quote, that has followed him ever since he restored the Church of Jesus Christ to the earth again. Well, after the ex-governor recuperated from his gunshot wounds, he went to a judge and filed charges claiming that Porter Rockwell was the attempted assassin and that Joseph Smith had ordered the hit. Well, at the time, Joseph didn't live in Missouri. He lived in Illinois, east of Missouri, across the Mississippi River. So the then current governor of Missouri writes an arrest warrant and makes an extradition order to get Joseph Smith back to Missouri so they can try him for this attempted murder. Well, when Porter and Joseph, again, who are both living in Illinois, find out that they're both being charged for this attempted assassination, and learning that there was an arrest warrant out and feeling that they're innocent, and that, again, this is just the most recent instance in a long string of persecution, they both go into hiding. And they had both barely made it out of Missouri and into Illinois with their lives after being threatened and shot at and chased out of the state a few years earlier. So they look at this unfounded charge of attempted assassination as a ploy to get them back into Missouri from where they had escaped, so that their murders can be accomplished like the Missourians feel they should have been. And so Porter goes back east and hides out in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And Joseph went into hiding just around the city that he lived in Nauvoo, Illinois. He stays at different relatives' houses and friends' houses, and he stays for a little while on an island in the middle of the Mississippi River. He keeps a low profile. And while he's in hiding, Joseph's wife, Emma, is writing letters to the governor of Illinois saying, please rescind this arrest warrant. Joseph is obviously innocent. The people in Missouri just hate us. They only want to kill my husband. You can't believe what they're telling you. After a couple months, Joseph starts to get letters from the governor of Illinois and his lawyers saying, just come up to the Illinois Capitol, and we've been talking with the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, and these charges have no legal standing. They say, we're not going to extradite you to Missouri, and it's ridiculous that you're charged with an attempted assassination, but you still need to come in and get this cleared up through the proper legal channels. So Joseph agrees. He comes out of 5 months of hiding, and he and a group of his friends travel to the capital of Illinois for a trial. And it's the biggest trial of the year. The courtroom's packed because of Joseph's growing religion and growing followers and this failed assassination attempt. Everybody wants to see the trial. And one of the people actually in attendance at the trial is Mary Todd Lincoln, who is Abraham Lincoln's new wife at the time. Well, after a couple days of the trial, the judge rules that the extradition order for Joseph to get sent back to Missouri is not valid, and Joseph is freed to go back to his hometown of Nauvoo. And so when Porter, who had been back east in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, hears that Joseph is free from this arrest warrant, and that Joseph is safe from getting sent to Missouri, Porter feels like it's safe for him to also head back home to Nauvoo. And on Porter's way back home, this bounty hunter catches him in St. Louis. So instead of Porter getting taken from St. Louis back north to Nauvoo, Illinois, he gets taken out west to Independence, Missouri. And he gets thrown in jail for the failed assassination attempt. And Porter's first put in an iron bar cell on the second floor of a jail. This is a common setup for the day. The jailer lived downstairs in the house, and then the jail was upstairs. And this is the cell room where there's iron bars and shackles and whatnot. And while Porter's there, he sees a rotating cast of characters coming in and out, and one of the men who actually gets brought in is a guy who was arrested for issuing fake U.S. Treasury notes. And we don't know a lot about this guy other than that he was referred to simply as Watson. Watson is later arrested in Baltimore, Maryland, long after this incident. Anyways, so Porter becomes acquainted with this guy, Watson, and finds out that he wants to escape. And he really wants to break out of jail. And Porter wants to escape as well. And not only does this guy want to escape, but somehow this guy was allowed to keep his saddlebags with all of his possessions in them while he was in jail. So anyway, Porter finds out that this guy has fire steel in his packs. And fire steel are these little metal rods that you can use to start fires with. And so Porter gets one and almost completely saws off his chains with a fire steel. But he can't finish the job. And there's this girl that lives across the street, and she's a slave. And sometimes she brings Porter food. So Porter gets her to bring him a knife. He lets down a rope in a basket, and she puts the knife in there. He hauls it up, and Porter saws his chains off the rest of the way. So now Porter and this guy are sitting in jail eating dinner, waiting for the jailer to come up and take their plates away when they're done. And the Treasury Notes guy, Watson, is eating a big meal, telling Porter that he's going to need his energy in the escape. And Porter's telling the guy, man, if you eat too much, you aren't going to be able to run out of here. The guy disagrees, though, and so the jailer comes up eventually to take away their empty plates, and Porter, with his chains sawed off, leaps up and grabs the jailer. And then Porter and Watson take the jailer's keys, and they lock him up in the jail, and they head downstairs where they run into the jailer's wife. And she's probably terrified to see two prisoners run down the stairs from where her husband just went up, but they tell her not to worry. They tell her that her husband isn't hurt, that they've just locked him up, and then they run outside. And so they get outside, and there's a 12-foot fence that they have to climb somehow in this escape process. I'm not entirely sure how the logistics of it work. Anyways, Porter throws the keys into some bushes, and he hops the fence and runs off. He gets a couple yards off, and he turns around to see that Watson is stuck up on the fence, and he can't get over. So Porter's thinking, I got to go back and help this guy. So he runs back and helps Watson over the fence, but by the time they get off and keep running again, they've lost too much ground in their escape attempt. The jailer's wife has alerted the town. Porter is winded, and they both get caught and get thrown back in jail. Well, a lot of people, and probably the governor included, assumed Joseph and Porter were the ones who tried to assassinate ex-Governor Boggs because a few years earlier, Governor Boggs had passed an executive order in Missouri, Order 44, which ordered members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to be exterminated and driven from the state. This order from the governor gave the state's militia authority to kill these Latter-day Saints and drive them out of their houses and off their lands. And so it's easy to see how one night, ex-Governor Boggs gets shot in his head with buckshot through his window, and he and a lot of people immediately think it must have been the Latter-day Saints. And there's a lot of built-in motivation that the shooter could probably have been an angry member of this new church looking for vengeance. Now, there's a lot of history leading up to this extermination order. Governor Boggs didn't wake up one day and just decide to exterminate and drive all the Latter-day Saints out of his state. The first settlers of the restored Church of Jesus Christ had moved to Missouri about 13 years before Joseph's death. They settled in Independence, Missouri. Independence would later be the site of ex-Governor Boggs' failed assassination attempt and is the location of Porter Rockwell's dungeon cell. At the time, the city of Independence is the very edge of Missouri. It's one of the state's westernmost cities. Missouri itself is the edge of America. It's the westernmost part of the country, and everything west of it is Indian territory. You could stand there just west of Independence and look out onto land that was not America. It wasn't a part of any, Western government, really. There were no rules, no anything. It was the blank slate of the Wild West. So Independence, Missouri, when the Latter-day Saints show up and start to settle it, 13 years before Joseph's death, is the American frontier. Independence is the head of the Santa Fe Trail. It's full of preachers from out east trying to convert the Indians to Christianity. In fact, the closest federal marshal lives in St. Louis, Missouri, which you'll remember is over 200 miles east of Independence along the Missouri River. And occasionally this marshal comes out to Independence with warrants to look for fugitives and criminals, but before he gets there, all the outlaws in town just run across the border and hang out in Indian territory until he leaves. So it's full of outlaws and criminals and fugitives and strictly Orthodox settlers from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You can imagine how that mixture of people would probably play out. And not only that, but the judges and sheriffs and other law officers in town regularly acknowledge that they can't even enforce the law. Lawlessness at the time is a pretty common trait to frontier Americans. After these first Latter-day Saint settlers lived in Independence for about 2 years, a mob got up and burned down their houses, and the roofs were torn off the houses that they didn't burn down, and the mob chased women and children across the plains in the middle of the night until their feet bled, and the Latter-day Saints had all their property taken, and they were forced to leave the county. They stayed in the state of Missouri, but they just left the county. And some of these settlers, after having their houses burned down, swam across the Missouri River in the middle of the night and escaped as refugees. And when these refugees went and talked first to the local sheriff and then the county judge about these attacks, it was not suggested that they take legal action against their enemies, but that they fight back. They were told to kill their attackers because the law couldn't do anything for them. Well, now this first instance of the Latter-day Saints being kicked out of Jackson County, Missouri, and being forced to settle as refugees in other parts of the state sets up this pattern of persecution that will follow them in Missouri all the way until Governor Boggs signs the extermination order against them. For the Latter-day Saints in Missouri, it's 8 years of escalations and rising tensions and increased conflict and small wars until the governor of Missouri says, here's an order, just kill them all and kick them out of the state. As a good summary of the tension between the two groups, between the Missourians and the Latter-day Saint settlers, one historian wrote that early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, quote, ran counter to ideas, institutions, and ways of life that were fundamental forces on the frontier, end quote. It was like oil and water trying to mix the Missourians and the Latter-day Saints. They just didn't mesh. And you have to think, you have moving into Missouri converts to this new religion. Most of them are from out east, where there are schools and roads and newspapers, and these people are all members of a new religion that isn't even 10 years old yet. And it's a religion that they're so zealous about that they've converted to it and then moved hundreds of miles across the country to settle a new land. So you have these eastern religious families settling the frontier in the middle of adventurers and fur trappers and fugitives. And so the primary source of conflict between the Missourians and the Latter-day Saints was found in these social, political, and economic differences that existed between the two groups. For example, you have all these eastern religious families move out to the frontier, and there are issues with slavery. The Latter-day Saints don't endorse it. They actually encourage freed slaves to settle with them. This state they just moved to, however, Missouri, is fiercely protective of its slavery practices. Numerous historians and people who lived with the members of the Restored Church of Jesus Christ in Missouri say that they think the biggest source of fighting between them and their neighbors was the Latter-day Saints' anti-slavery feelings and expressions, or at the very least the fear that the Latter-day Saints were anti-slavery. Furthermore, the Latter-day Saint settlers are colonizers. They moved into Missouri in 1831 and start building numerous settlements. They start taking over large swaths of land. These Easterners roll in and buy up hundreds of acres of land, sometimes buying land directly up underneath settlers who were waiting to come into ownership of that land through squatters' rights. Well, at the time of these Latter-day Saints living in Missouri, some of their biggest enemies were men squatting on federal land, waiting to earn it through squatters' rights, but who, when the church came in and legally bought the land out from under them, became furious. They looked at this as almost like theft. And other things that added to this conflict in Missouri is that the Latter-day Saints are very clannish and insular. However, their neighbors, who are frontiersmen, are rugged and individualistic. They're opposites. And because these Latter-day Saints are clannish and insular, they immediately show up and turn into a very powerful voting bloc. A voting bloc that can sway elections in any direction it chooses. And they can sway elections to favor their religious doctrines and beliefs, and they can get their own people, other members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, elected as judges and council members and sheriffs, and then further control of local government. And this makes people very uncomfortable. At the time of the extermination order, the majority of Latter-day Saints lived in Missouri. They didn't live in Independence anymore since they'd been kicked out of Jackson County, but they lived in settlements about 50 miles north of Independence. So the Latter-day Saints all throughout the 1830s are settling into Missouri, right in the middle of a community that hates them, that doesn't understand them, and it isn't understood by them. And over the years, this hate manifests itself in numerous altercations and fights between the two groups. And I say fights and altercations, it's less that and more of just outright persecution often. The Latter-day Saint settlers are having their houses burned and their properties being stolen, and they're raped, murdered, beaten, and attacked by these angry mobs. Now, throughout the entire time the members of the church are in Missouri, they will occasionally fight back, and they occasionally make a stand, but the gauntlet is never thrown down. They never look to finally end the persecution. They just try to curb it. And the whole time they keep asking for help from the local government, and they keep not receiving any. And every contention and fight and disagreement between the Latter-day Saints and their neighbors have only compounded one onto the other, so that eventually the state of Missouri decides it needs to just step in and officially get involved in this war that has broken out between the Latter-day Saints and their neighbors. But surprising the Latter-day Saints, the state of Missouri doesn't come out to protect them. It comes out and drives them out under the threat of extermination. Now, Governor Boggs wrote Executive Order 44, but Missouri's state militia was responsible for executing the order. When instead of marching out and fully executing the order and killing everybody, they go out to do that, but they end up using the extermination order as a bargaining tool. The state militia said that they would not massacre all of the Latter-day Saints in exchange for the confiscation of their land and property and the imprisonment of their leaders. So Governor Boggs' extermination order resulted in Latter-day Saints being driven from the state and having their property stolen, and their leaders, including Joseph Smith, being thrown in jail. And because of Governor Boggs' extermination order, most of the Latter-day Saints living in Missouri moved back east across the Mississippi River to a city called Commerce in the state of Illinois. Commerce was in western Illinois, right in the hill next to the Mississippi River. Ultimately, so many members of the church move into this city, they kind of take it over and change the name of it to Nauvoo. And this is the city, Nauvoo, that was built by refugees that I mentioned in the introduction to the podcast. At the time of the extradition request, Nauvoo has about 12,000 citizens living in it, making it the largest city in Illinois. And again, this is where Porter and Joseph were living when they found out that they were being charged with the attempted assassination of Governor Boggs, or of ex-Governor Boggs. But anyways, now back to the present. It's December of 1843. The Latter-day Saints have been in Nauvoo, Illinois for about 4 years now. They've escaped from Missouri into Nauvoo and have been building their city and growing their community for 4 years. And this failed assassination attempt has brought these Missouri memories and persecutions back to the front of their mind. Not that they probably ever totally left, but it's back to the forefront again. It's caused them to resurface, and it reminds the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo of the danger that still exists in Missouri. It also reminds the Missourians of the dangerous Latter-day Saints to the east. In fact, Missourian vigilantes start crossing over the Mississippi River into Missouri or into Illinois and Nauvoo to try and kill Joseph Smith or kidnap him. And Missourian law officers also start crossing over the Mississippi River to try and bring Joseph back into Missouri. And this is going to be an important part of the story of Joseph's death. The idea that these refugees, these strangers and pilgrims on the American frontier, have been persecuted for 14 years. And so everything they see and everything that happens to them is in this context of 14 years of persecution and is in this context of we have to protect ourselves. And this extradition order that Joseph be sent back to Missouri for the failed assassination attempt is a reminder to all the religious refugees in Nauvoo that these frontiersmen still want Joseph Smith dead, because the Missourians believe if you cut off the head, the body will die. If you get rid of Joseph Smith, you get rid of the restored Church of Jesus Christ that he founded. And if you get rid of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you get rid of its powerful voting bloc and its stealing of land and its taking away all your income and these political and economic repercussions of these settlers out in the frontier. And so now Porter is in the dungeon, but he isn't in this dungeon because of the failed assassination attempt. He's been cleared of the murder charges against ex-Governor Boggs. Well, in fact, official charges were never even brought against Porter. After being captured by the bounty hunter and sitting in jail for 10 months, Porter's brought before a grand jury, and they decide that there's not even enough evidence to indict him in the attempted murder, because essentially the whole case rested on the affidavit of Governor Boggs. And Governor Boggs got shot in the head, in the window, or through the window on a rainy night, and never even thought that Porter or Joseph did it until he started reading about it in the newspaper, and he thought, oh, maybe they did do it. Anyways, Governor Boggs didn't have any actual proof that Porter and Joseph were responsible for the murder, so there's nothing to go on. But Porter is still in jail because of 2 failed escape attempts he had. And we talked about one of the failed escape attempts earlier in the podcast with Porter and Watson. And so while Porter is in this dungeon, the county sheriff opens up the hatch, and he and some guys lower down the ladder or rope and come into the jail and talk to Porter, and they say, quote, "We have spies all around Nauvoo," end quote, which again is where Joseph and a lot of the Latter-day Saints are settled. And these quotes that I'm telling you are from Porter Rockwell's retelling of the story after he had gotten out of jail. And the sheriff says, quote, "We know how much Joseph trusts you. If you could just get him in a carriage or on horseback somewhere so that we could apprehend him, we will protect you," end quote. They tell Porter that all he has to do is name his price, and the citizens of the county will donate or raise whatever he requests, so that he'll never have a hard day in his life again. Quote, "You just need to bring us Joseph Smith," end quote, they say. "And we'll give you money, houses, horses, whatever you want." And Porter looks them in the face and says, quote, "You all go and be damned, and then I won't help you," end quote. The Missourians learn that they cannot use Porter Rockwell to get to Joseph Smith. They're going to have to find another way. And so it's December of 1843, and Porter Rockwell has told the sheriff in Jackson County, Missouri, that he isn't going to help him capture Joseph Smith. And after going to court for his escape attempt, Porter Rockwell is let out of prison. He was ordered to serve only 5 minutes in jail for his escape attempt, and then he's let go. It's the winter, and Porter is walking back east through fields and forests to avoid angry Missouri vigilantes that he might encounter if he were to take roads back east. And at the same time that Porter's walking back, there's a large meeting of Illinois citizens who are angry with the Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith and the rest of the Latter-day Saints got run out of Missouri, but they already have new enemies in Illinois. There's a political organization in the surrounding towns and counties that has cropped up, and they call themselves the Anti-Mormons. Now, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints refer to themselves as saints or Latter-day Saints, but almost everyone that they're interacting with at the time who's not a member of their church is calling these people Mormons. And this is because at the same time that Joseph Smith was founding the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he was translating and publishing a book of scripture called the Book of Mormon. And since at the time this book of scripture was unique to Joseph Smith's religion, the name Mormon stuck as a shorthand both for the religion in the term Mormonism and for its members in the term Mormons. So the enemies of the church at this time have started a group, and they call themselves Anti-Mormons to express that they are directly opposed to the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Well, and these Anti-Mormons have most of the same issues with the Latter-day Saints that the Missourians had, but they have an added problem, which is that they're dealing with a large influx of immigrants from Great Britain who are converts to this new church. Latter-day Saint missionaries had been in Great Britain since 1837, teaching and baptizing people over there. The converts to the church, however, did not begin immigrating to America to join up with other like-minded converts and Joseph Smith, their religion's prophet, until 1840. And that was about a year after the Latter-day Saints had been driven out of Missouri. So you have Hancock County. It's this little county in western Illinois that for 4 years now is first filling up with Latter-day Saint refugees from this war in Missouri, and then filling up with immigrants who are converts to the refugees' church, and there's thousands of them. In fact, from 1840 until 2 years after Joseph's death, Nauvoo sees 5,000 converts come in from Great Britain. So for the locals, this is a problem. Nauvoo is the largest city in the county and in the state, and has 12,000 people living in it. Most of them are Latter-day Saints, and about 5,000 of them are immigrants. So it's a culture change for people that lived in Missouri before the Latter-day Saints got there. They take the jobs, they take land, and they create voting blocks. And they create a pretty efficient voting block because they're not a nebulous group of immigrants, and it's not a nebulous group of refugees. They all have a common religion, and they all have a common leader, Joseph Smith. And all these people that live here are tied together through the prophet. And that's why the anti-Mormons want to kill him. They think that if you kill Joseph Smith, all the refugees and immigrants and religious followers will just kind of fall away and go back to doing whatever it was they did before Joseph showed up. And this anti-Mormon group is so anti-Latter-day Saints that when they hold their town meetings and interested citizens show up who want to take a more moderate approach to kicking the Latter-day Saints out of Illinois, or who want to maybe talk through the kicking out process at a slow pace, they get shouted down. And they're told, when you saw the notice for this meeting in the newspaper and saw that it was a meeting of the anti-Mormons, what did you think we were going to talk about here? We don't have room for moderates. You're either completely on board with us or you're not with us at all. And this winter, the anti-Mormons are holding town meetings and electing representatives to go meet at the upcoming regional convention of anti-Mormons in Carthage, Illinois. Carthage is the county seat of Hancock County, which again is the county that Nauvoo is in. And at the December Carthage convention, there are two groups within the organization. There are the fire eaters who just want Joseph Smith dead, and they want to do it themselves right this instant. And then there are the more calculating men who want Joseph dead, but they want someone else to do it so they can keep their hands clean. They want the law to do it for them. The spokesman for the anti-Mormons is a guy named Thomas Sharp. And Thomas is the editor of the Anti-Mormons newspaper. It's published about 17 miles south of Nauvoo. The newspaper is called the Warsaw Signal, and Thomas is one of the guys who wants the Latter-day Saints to be run off and Joseph Smith killed by the government. He doesn't want to get his hands dirty. So Thomas Sharp starts writing letters to the governor of Illinois, Governor Ford, trying to get the governor to go into Nauvoo and arrest Joseph Smith. And the governor is telling Thomas that he can't do that. Illinois isn't the frontier. They try to keep the rule of law and try to keep order more than their neighbors to the west. The governor tells Thomas that he can only persecute the Latter-day Saints if a war breaks out, and even then, only if the Latter-day Saints happen to be the first aggressors. And this is a great example of how Illinois is different from Missouri. In Missouri, when a war broke out and the Latter-day Saints weren't the first aggressors, they were still the ones that were punished. So things are done a little differently in Illinois than they are in Missouri. And the anti-Mormons want to run off their neighbors like was done in Missouri, but they can't. So Thomas Sharp and the anti-Mormons decide the best thing they can do is get Joseph Smith back to Missouri. If they can just get him back there, back to the Wild West, then the Missourians can kill Joseph Smith and the Illinois anti-Mormon party will look like they weren't involved in it at all. So all these fire eaters in the anti-Mormon party are going around saying, let's kill him now, let's do it, let's get it over with. Thomas Sharp is telling everyone, no, let's keep our minds about ourselves. The governor of Missouri, Governor Reynolds, is our ally. He's helping us. We just have to get Joseph over the river and Governor Reynolds will help. Well, a few weeks after getting out of prison, after walking through the backwoods of Missouri and crossing the Mississippi River, Porter Rockwell staggers into Joseph Smith's house in Nauvoo during a Christmas party, actually on Christmas Day. He's staggering across the room, his hair's long and dirty and from not being washed or cleaned or combed for 10 months, and no one could recognize him. Joseph Smith, his childhood friend, one of his closest friends, doesn't even recognize him from across the room, so Joseph comes up to kick Porter out of his house, but stops when he sees that it's actually Porter who's escaped from Missouri. And Joseph is overcome with happiness and tells Porter at that moment, he prophesies in the name of the Lord, quote, Orrin Porter Rockwell, so long as you shall remain loyal and true to thy faith, you need fear no enemy. Cut not thy hair, and no bullet or blade can harm thee. End quote. Like Samson in the Bible, Porter is told that if he never cuts his hair, a bullet will never harm him. And this is the beginning, really, of Porter Rockwell becoming a mythical type figure out in the frontier. He becomes this gunslinger in the Wild West who never cuts his hair and can't be killed by another man because of a promise given to him in Illinois by a prophet. And from that point on, a lot of men will try and hunt Porter down and kill him, and a lot of men will fail. Well, as a side note, a few years earlier, before this, Joseph is writing about what he called, quote, laying the foundation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, end quote. And he's writing about the people that helped him lay the foundation of this church he established. And he wrote in his book, he wrote in this book, that there was one man he would mention, Porter Rockwell, who, quote, is now a fellow wanderer with myself, an exile from his home because of the murderous deeds and infernal, fiendish disposition of the indefatigable and unrelenting hand of the Missourians. He is an innocent and a noble boy, and was an innocent and a noble child, and my soul loves him. Let this be recorded forever and ever. Let the blessings of salvation and honor be his portion. End quote. Joseph Smith loves Porter Rockwell. He sees themselves as fellow wanderers, as strangers and pilgrims on the American frontier. So the Christmas party ends, the Christmas season is over, and it's now 1844, the year of Joseph Smith's death. Back in Missouri, Governor Reynolds is eating breakfast one morning, and after he finishes, he goes to his desk and writes a letter to his friend about how he has been abused by his enemies for the last 12 months and about how much of a burden it is to him. He finishes the short letter, ties a piece of twine to the trigger of a gun, he puts it against his forehead and pulls. And we don't really know the reason for why Governor Reynolds kills himself. It's a mystery. In his suicide note, he mentions that he was tired of being abused by his enemies. But historians today aren't really sure who his enemies were. He was mentioned as having melancholia and being depressed. Historians believe that that had something to do with his suicide, but how much we'll probably not know exactly. When Thomas Sharp found out that the governor of Missouri had just committed suicide, he was beside himself. He wrote in his anti-Mormon paper, quote, our city is overshadowed with gloom and distress. Governor Reynolds is no more, end quote. And it's with Governor Reynolds' suicide that now the anti-Mormons in Illinois feel alone. The man whom they felt was their biggest governmental help in Missouri in accomplishing the government-sanctioned death of Joseph Smith is gone. Their scapegoat is gone. And from here, Thomas Sharp, who was one of the key figures in the death of Joseph Smith and one of the key figures in our story going forward, turns hard. He and other members of the anti-Mormon party, who used to feel like they could let the government take out Joseph and Latter-day Saints, now feel like they're going to have to kill Joseph themselves. And they're going to have to do it in Illinois where they live. And they're probably going to have to do it outside the law. They might have to take the law into their own hands. In fact, Thomas Sharp turns so hard against Joseph Smith that in the process he becomes incredibly frustrated with the governor of Illinois, Governor Ford, who also, by the way, will be an important figure in the upcoming story. Thomas becomes so frustrated with Governor Ford's inability and failure to deliver Joseph Smith to prison or death that Thomas ends up coming up with a plan that will allow him to not only kill Joseph Smith, but also the governor at the same time, so that Thomas can rid himself of two of his problems at once. And so our story moves now away from ex-Governor Boggs and the dead Governor Reynolds. Thomas Sharp can't use them anymore. Thomas Sharp and the anti-Mormons' attention turns from Missouri to Illinois. Almost 6 months after Porter Rockwell got out of jail and made it to Joseph's house on a Christmas day, Joseph Smith will die. Joseph's enemies would get him to Carthage and murder him. On the next episode of the podcast, Joseph's enemies outside the Restored Church of Jesus Christ aren't the only ones who want him dead. Within the church itself, a group of members become so upset with the prophet that they too begin to lay plans for his destruction. This podcast was written and recorded by myself, Stephen Detloff. Music for the podcast comes from the song Carthage Waltz. It was written and recorded by Michael Hinckley.